like to start this conversation with an acknowledgement of country by saying the Science Gallery in Melbourne, and I, and no doubt Nwando, celebrates and acknowledges the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we work and live. And for me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge First Nations people as our first artists and scientists. The Science Gallery is situated on the traditional land of the Wurundjeri people and is part of the Science Gallery network pioneered by Trinity College in Dublin. It's located at Melbourne Connect, a new innovation precinct in Carlton, Melbourne, and the gallery is part of the Museums and Collections Department of the University of Melbourne. And an exhibition that's currently on at the gallery is called Mental Head Inside, which is a series of 20 experimental projects and pieces designed to ask people to revisit their assumptions of what normality is and mental health and well-being. And it seems to me to be doing a remarkable job of that. And I'm here today with Nwando Ebizie, who has a piece at the exhibition, and we're going to talk about that and various other things. I'm Simon Cropper, and I work at the University of Melbourne in the Complex Human Data Hub, and I'm particularly interested in how we create the reality that we perceive inside our heads. We have something out there that we kind of think, well, it's the same for everybody. We have a version of it inside our heads, which we hope is as similar to everyone else's version that we can actually communicate and connect with them, but actually is completely unique to every person. And it's fascinated me for years now how people choose to communicate that difference, how different it truly can be, how it can change within a person, and how we deal with it when it's dramatically different from other people. And Nwando uses this in her work because of her own experiences, which I would now like to introduce you to Nwando Ebizie, who will tell you more about herself.
Hey, thank you for that introduction, Simon. My name is Nwando, and I'm a multidisciplinary artist. I'm based in the UK, in Yorkshire, and I created this installation, which is part of Mental, called Distorted Constellations. It's a part of a series of projects that I do, which are around perceptual reality. They invite people into an alternate dimension to, I guess, in effect, show a mirror to them. So I guess, like, by exploring my own perceptual reality and placing them in amongst it, I'm doing a few things. I'm showing them an alternate perceptual reality, but I'm also asking them to question their own and to try and question this assumption that there's this objective shared reality, rather that we're in our own perceptual bubbles. And I within my work, I always have a lot of myth and ritual practice, again inviting people to view reality through a lens of the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, the rituals that we engage in a solo way, but also communally. And I always love to connect science and art, along with lots of different art forms, installation art, music, movement practices, experimental theatre, visual art, and all of those things are in the installation.
Yes, and I was about to mention that the installation is really it's quite full on, for want of a better word. And so I went there. I've been there twice now, and it really is. It sort of challenges and sort of, I was going to say assails, but that's, for some reason that doesn't sound right. But it really grabs every part of you as you go through it, and the movement thing is something that was really noticeable to me, as well as the layering. Now, Nwando's exhibition, not sure if you said it was called Distorted Constellations, and is, as you say, loosely based upon your experience, which has sort of developed a name over the last few years. Your experience of the world is known as, or your version of the world is known as visual snow, or you have visual snow. Would you? I feel like it's a very evocative term, and it's a quite clearly descriptive term, very pretty term in many ways. Do you feel that it's a reasonable term to describe how you do experience the world?
So visual snow syndrome is what it's called now, and I think that so I'd say first of all, I think my okay, I think that it's one part of my experience, and I think that definitely my ideas since making the project have evolved in that I'm aware of the limitations of trying to represent one part of my experience and even one part of my experience at a moment in time. In terms of the naming of visual snow syndrome, I think it was named after what was felt to be the main symptom. And I think at the time when it was coined, there was the idea there was like 4 symptoms, and now the number of symptoms has massively exploded. I can't remember if it's like about 12 or 15 in terms of the academic literature. In terms of people around the world who are talking amongst themselves who have visual snow syndrome, it's even larger.
Yeah.
So it's, in a way, I think there's an issue with the name, because as I guess with many coinages of any kind of syndrome or disorder or disease, that it can be limiting. And the reason why that's an issue with this particular one is because it's so perceptual. It describes something, one, that other people quite often don't experience, but then there's an assumption that that is the experience, whereas it's much larger than that. So I think it's useful. I mean, naming is useful. Naming is great for people who quite often might have felt like they, I don't know, ostracized in some way, or like there's something really wrong with them, or like they can't communicate with people about what they experience. So it's great to have a name for something. But yeah, I think there's some limitations to it. But I've never really thought about what you could call it instead.
I think that you're right about the idea of a name. Like scientists, they desperately want to simplify things, and they like to put things in sort of little boxes. And for not terrible reasons or anything, but what it can do is simplify something far too much, and also kind of exclude things by saying, well, you're not in this little box, so therefore you're outside the box, which and from many perspectives can be problematic. But as you say, the flip side is it can be helpful for someone to say, at least, well, I can identify, I can say that's what it is. So when someone asks me, I can say, yes, that's what that is. And so give them a simple answer rather than you having to every time describe everything.
Can I ask you a question?
Please.
So in terms of, could you say a bit more about your practice, and then also how visual snow syndrome connects to your research?
I sort of started off in, I suppose, what's what we consider really quite basic vision science research, as in how do we see colour and how do we see things move. And as time went on, and I did more and more of that, I started to realize, particularly with colour, there are remarkable differences in the perception of colour that people have, even though we have developed this specific set of terms to subdivide the colour spectrum, the visible spectrum, up into sections that we can identify and give a name to. And so therefore we can communicate colours to one another by using this name, because they are important in our ability to communicate with one another. But what that doesn't mean is we all see the same thing at all. And of course, there's the old philosophical question, is my red the same as your red, etc. And it's like, no, it's not. Everyone's red's unique. And I think, and as this is often the case with my work, is that it was actually trying to teach it that made me think of different ways of doing it. So I'd start trying to describe colour vision to students, which is, quite dry sometimes and a bit technical, and you need someone to be motivated to find out more, to actually go through the process of understanding how it might work. And so I'd ask them to think about describing a colour without using a simile or a metaphor to somebody else. It's actually impossible. You can't do it. And so we've developed this whole set of terms simply because colour is so very important to us, and it's important to everyone. So there are different numbers of terms in different languages. And so Western languages tend to have 11 basic colour terms, but a lot of other languages don't. And they're also culturally quite specific. And so depending on your environment where you live, those colour terms there'll be more of them for the colours that are more prevalent in your environment, because you've got to communicate them more. But they're still really important for communicating to one another various things, like, something that is a particular colour, or a path to go on which is very hard to see but has a particular colour at a particular time of day, for instance, or something like that. And I think that was then when I first started to think about how people see things differently. And colour comes up an awful lot in perceptual aberrations, however, maybe that isn't the right word, but differences. Colour often will come up as being, well, I actually am seeing these colours differently. And a very common one is migraine auras. So some people who have migraines actually have visual perturbations, particularly in their periphery, when they're experiencing a migraine. Some have them without any pain, so they have a relatively pleasant migraine experience rather than a horrible, unpleasant one. And colour comes up a lot in that. Colour comes up a lot in the use of psychedelics and the experience then, and because one of the first obvious differences in the world under those circumstances is movement changes and colour changes. Things start to become more colourful. And I think artists in particular use colour because my sense is that there's potentially a little bit more of a heightened sense of colour in their world, and so some of the colours are more vibrant and stronger, and so it gives them something to take and then represent in what they do. And of course, synesthesia, which is another, I would say, relatively common named visual difference, for want of a better word, is frequently the combination of colour with something that would not normally combine with that. So letter and colour, or sound and colour. And that sort of, I suppose that's that difference and that unique nature of perception, which the more you look at it, the more, to me, seems to be clearly identified by the sense of colour, made me start to think about, well, how do we create the world anyway? How do we associate these things together to turn it into something that I'm experiencing as my reality, that's functional enough for me to get through and adaptive, and I can communicate with people? And yet there's been a whole series of decisions made by my brain to come up with this particular answer to, well, that's what I'm looking at the moment, and then a whole lot more to the next thing. And that's continually changing and ongoing. And then I still do this. I'll get to the point where I think it's amazing that we agree on anything.
I know.
And so, I love it when people actually do present something that's clearly different and say, well, this is my, a representation of my version of the world. And you're just like, wow, that's really good, because there's bits there that you recognise, saying, well, it's a bit like mine. That bit isn't. But you realise then that, we're all in our own perceptual bubble, if you like, as you said. But there's enough of us, like a Venn diagram, overlapping for us to, generally speaking, communicate well enough with one another for us to exist most of the time. Yeah. And, when sometimes you pop out and there's no way you can exist with anyone else, and you have to pop back in. So it's sort of that gradual change from being what turned out to be, when you do colour vision, it's sort of, it's dealing with tiny, tiny little things. It's been a fascination to scientists for hundreds of years, and the simplest questions we still don't have answered. And so you're like dealing with these tiny things, but then when you look at that, it sort of blows out into this, how do we agree on anything when you can't even work out whether a t-shirt's the same colour? And then it changes when you go into a different light source anyway. So, and And I think that the snow aspect, I think this came up when we spoke before, and I was trying to remember exactly what you said, because you said something really important. But that sort of, one of the things that forms a kind of, I guess, an underlying theory to a lot of the stuff I do is that the system is constantly making these decisions about whether something's signal or whether it's noise. If it's noise, you try and ignore it. If it's signal, you try and pass it on. And a signal is important and noise is not important. But whether something's signal or noise in terms of neurons and what they do together is entirely dependent upon the decision. There's no difference between what a neuron's doing if it's going to be noise or signal. It might be a little bit of a greater amplitude or something in terms of its output. But if the decision made by the next stage that it connects to is, well, I'm going to pass it on, then it becomes signal. If that next stage makes a decision not passing that on, it's noise. The input's the same. And so changing the noise within the system will change the outcome of the system. There will be, in terms of perception and many other things, a perceptual consequence to having more noise. And more noise occurs in the simplest of things, being overtired, having too much coffee, all of these things, just being stressed. Everything's a bit more jangly inside, but the jangle has an outcome. It's not just jangle. It can be a perception, you might see something, you might hear your name or whatever. And I think fundamentally that's what dreams are. It's the brain having an ongoing set of noise, and rather than it just being meaningless noise, the brain is a slave to making sense. So it goes and makes some sense. And that's your dream. And you wake up in this sort of process of coming out of that, and you piece it together into some narrative and go, well, that was my dream. You've been aware of all these experiences you've had whilst you've been asleep, and that sort of becomes the dream to us. And what psychedelics do is they reduce the amount of inhibition that you have available to in your system for a short period of time. So there's more noise, there's a perceptual consequence to that. And there are similarities to psychotic episodes as well, the idea there being more noise in the system. And there are properties of visual snow, as you've described it and presented, which are more noise. But there are some properties, which I think this is what we sort of talked about before, which seem to be quite uniquely not quite the same as just more noise. There's something a bit special about it and a bit different, as if that noise just sort of takes on a slightly different form. And one of the things that sort of I was going to ask you as well, do you feel like, do you dream with the same kind of perceptual version of the world, or does it sort of sometimes feel different than you normally see the world?
Yeah, well, so maybe I should say what some of the symptoms are of visual snow syndrome. So the classic one, after which it's named, visual snow, some people describe as seeing kind of like an old analog TV static overlaid over everything. For me, I'd say, and so which also indicates the kind of color, that it might be black and white. Talking about color, whereas mine, I'd say, is more like the tones in a pointillist painting, kind of desaturated, kind of rainbow colors, and it's transparent, and it can vary in different people in like size of grain, or transparency, color, speed of movement of the kind of particles. And then there's other visual symptoms like so like a big class of visual symptoms, photophobia, so seeing things like starbursts, like points of light emanating from real light, and seeing halos around light, palinopsia, seeing after images of things in the visual field, and then non-visual symptoms like tinnitus. A lot of people, there seems to be like a comorbidity with experiencing migraine. And then there's the psychological things, that there seem to be comorbidities with like depression and anxiety. And there's also some I think some nervous kind of muscular things that are being added into the syndrome as well now. So a whole host of symptoms, of which I say I experience or have experienced all of them. And the thing with visual snow syndrome, which they first realized it was different from migraine aura, because at first they were calling it persistent migraine aura, but then they realized that no, it's like it is consistent. And not only that, that it's many people, I think at the moment about 40% of people have had it for as long as they can remember. And it's yeah, so it's all the time, always in the perceptual field, because it's not just visual. Okay, now, and do I dream in visual snow? So I was thinking about that, and I was trying to notice it over the last few nights, because I also lucid dream a lot, so I can like wake up in my dreams and go, okay, what's happening? And I don't think I do, but I need to examine it more.
That's interesting that you don't, in the sense that you sort of, because I suppose, so when you're asleep, there's very little sensory input. Your eyes are closed. There's a sort of reduction in your auditory sensitivity. You get, obviously, somatosensory input from your sheets in your bed, but that's sort of more,
and some visual, right? Like you can sense the lights.
You sort of, if it's very bright, you can, and it goes through the eyelids. And I mean, when you close your eyes, you still sort of have a visual, kind of, sparkling in the world, just from the physical sort of perturbation of your photoreceptors, amongst other things, which is why when you rub your eyes, you get more. But it's basically, it's very attenuated compared to the normal world where bang, everything's coming in, you've got to sort it all out, you've got to basically ignore a whole load of stuff just to deal with the world. And the sort of the snow aspect, or the sort of the symptoms of the syndrome are also attenuated when you dream, then you're probably getting a sort of a less snowy version of the world, a sort of a cleaner version of the world without all of that extra stuff that does seem to come through when you're awake and your system is fully active. So you're sort of, but like you say, it's very, dream research, and people do that. It's one of it's almost impossible to get data from.
Right.
When clearly they're asleep, you can't ask them.
Yeah. Although, yeah, I mean, I can concentrate on things for a while. Like I can think about it while I'm awake, and I can kind of research it in my dream more.
I think that would be fascinating, actually. It really would. And I think when we spoke before, it sort of came out. Does it sort of ebb and flow? Does it? You just have times when it's more or less intense, like if you're a bit tired or stressed or whatever, or is it a bit more constant than that?
Yeah, I think it does ebb and flow, but I think that there's the complication in kind of thinking about it, which is that, there's that classic thing, if you think about something, you notice it more. And I think also there's like positive and negative associations with it that aren't necessarily correlated with the kind of, I was reading in some of the literature, they talk about severity. Yeah. So sometimes when it's more severe for me, it's not necessarily more disturbing or painful. So when I'm dancing, like in kind of like dance classes or something, I think it's something to do with concentration, the same as when I'm producing music. So I was recording a singer yesterday, and the tinnitus and the kind of snow were very intense. But I don't know, and I could also feel that like my skin was feeling a bit tingly, so everything was just feeling a bit tingly, and that's the kind of an increase in severity. But it's kind of connected. It felt very connected with me being a very concentrated, quite kind of like mental flow kind of state, like feeling very open, also with meditation, things like this. So it's difficult. And then, because then also the issue of language comes in. So severity versus intensity versus, and then like the negative or positive associations with those things. So, yeah, but then there are very clear times sometimes with like you're saying, like tiredness, stress, where it's very intense, and then it also feels painful, tiring. But I find it hard to separate that off into this idea of it being a syndrome versus just being kind of part of the way that I deal with the world and regulate. So
syndrome is a bit one of those words, even through literature, the syndrome in the title of a book is like, well, that's not going to be about something good, is it? It's like some disaster because it's a syndrome.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's sort of, and it kind of almost primes of that, those assumption of it being negative, which, I think that links in really nicely to what Mental is trying to do as an exhibition, what I think hopefully a lot of psychologists are also trying to do, which is just normalise differences in personal versions of the world so that there's less stigma about them. We understand we all have them, and it's not like someone's grown a wart on their brain, so they're different. It's actually the brain doing exactly the thing that it does all the time, just probably a little bit more efficiently sometimes, and so people do see a few more things, or maybe do hear something else. And we're constantly making those mistakes, but just generally correcting them. So the problem comes if you don't manage to correct, and that causes a difficulty in communicating with somebody or whatever it is. I had a quick look at the responses to our survey. So we did a survey for benefit of people watching, listening, sort of just before people went into Nwando's exhibit and just after. It was really simple, really brief, because it was, the thing was not about the survey. The thing was about distorted constellations. But I had a quick look. We got 250 responses so far, which is pretty good. And a variety of responses. There's a lot of really positive comments about people liking it. And also, and it seems to me, and as I say, it was a quick look, but it looks like one of the questions we asked is, do you think everyone experiences the same version of the world? I think there was another one. And then we asked them the same question when they came out. And there was quite a lot of people that went, oh, really? Maybe they don't then. Which I think is certainly is one of your goals, I think, with your work, is to say, this is someone else's world, it's no different, it's just as valid as yours, it's just not the same. Some of those comments when we asked, are there any similarities to the things that you experience in your perceptual world to the visitors to the exhibit? There was quite a few people who sort of said yes. So there was migraine came up when people have headaches, when they're very tired. I mean, someone was saying, well, sometimes they have something which causes their eyes to sting a bit, I think. And so they were saying, well, sometimes when I rub my eyes, I get these flashes of things, which is actually through distorting the photoreceptors a little bit. So yeah, there's some really quite nice responses from that, but it's pretty obvious from their response that they've enjoyed going there, and it's caused them to think about stuff, which I think is great.
That is great. And it's I've done the exhibition in a few different places, I think 3 other places before it came to Melbourne, and there is always some kind of like questionnaire, because I'm really interested in this idea of like, can art also be a science experiment, and can we learn more about each other through experiencing it. And there's always a number of people who come out having realized that they have visual snow or something else about their perception, and thought for the first time, oh, I've never thought to ask anybody if they also experience this. So, and I think that makes for a healthier culture, that acceptance of difference at such a fundamental human level, because it's the point of humanity, right? That's the really special thing about us, that we have this variance in brains. It's like, it's a feature, not a bug, which I love. But you were saying just before we started talking that you've had similar experiences since we've been working together.
Yeah, so certainly the prevalence of people who have visual snow has, like, I think I'd heard about it before, and I think I'd met one person who had it. But yeah, since working with you, I've met 6 people who've had it. 3 of my students have got it. They're all really interested in doing some work on it. And so we can sort of actually, as you say, sort of expand it a bit more into something experimental and get people to look at stuff. And I think I've been thinking of sort of some stimuli we could use and ask people, with or without visual so, to look at the stimuli and give a response to it. And I have been, certainly since the first time I saw the exhibition, I don't even know what to, the experience, Distorted Constellations, whatever. I was, it was sort of like quite late at night, and I was sat out on the deck, and I was sort of just looking really carefully at things and sort of trying to pick up kind of like that sort of, that jangling to it, to things I was seeing, and there was something there. I mean, it wasn't so much a case of me having visual snow, more a case of just trying to pick it out as features of my own perception, particularly in that dark, noisy version of the world that we, as we go into a darkness where we see less and less, essentially the world becomes noisier and noisier, and trying to relate those things to what I'd experienced in your piece. And
wow.
Yeah. And that's really...
Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say it's one of the best things about what I do. So researching into sensation and perception, it's like you got your little lab in your head. It's like, great, sit down and look at stuff for a while.
Well, and I think that's the fascinating thing about, like, I kind of assume with all perception that it's a spectrum. And so, and that's one of the things I'm really fascinated about, these syndromes and perceptual differences that might be more extreme. What they can tell us about the general population and generally about perception, and can you concentrate hard enough and get a sense of the snow, and then what does that mean for someone like me with migraine? Like what's happening there? And I think that I think I love doing this piece because over the 10 years of visual snow research, at first they thought it was a rare, extremely rare condition, and now I think they think it's like 2% of the population, which means it's no longer rare. That's out of the rare. But if we're having these experiences where, 3 people within your group,
I know, I was quite surprised.
It sounds like it might be really getting towards, really.
Well, I think there's more people with visual snow at the moment amongst my cohort of students than there are with synesthesia, which is doing quite well. The amount of publicity synesthesia has had over the years.
Yeah, it's more glamorous, maybe. But and it's because these things are really hard to talk about.
Yeah.
How do you talk about the language of, what's the language of, like, that was one thing I found growing up, was, I think the first questions I'd ask people were, when you look at the sky, is it like sparkling? So I used to really enjoy looking up at the sky on a sunny day, just at the blue and seeing the kind of, so it's kind of sparkly, like whizzy dots. And I just wondered, do other people see that? And I'd say until I was in my 20s, I couldn't get an answer out of anybody. It was mostly kind of dismissed as like, I don't know what you're talking about. Which is, it also makes you feel really bad about yourself. It's really like,
doesn't encourage you to ask any more questions, does it?
Yeah. So I'm not surprised we don't. So I think it might be something that has been really hard to communicate about. And I've also spent quite a lot of time looking back at artists in history and writers, and I was at the Wellcome Collection for a while, and I was trying to, like, I was using words that I might use, like sparkly, or analog TV static obviously couldn't have been used pre-20th century. So, language is really culturally specific as well. So we can't even share about our experiences very easily.
Yeah, and even analog TV is sort of out of the realm of your average 17-year-old these days. I say, because I talk about visual noise and stuff in terms of sort of more simple visual things, and they go, I say it's like an analog detuned TV, and they kind of,
yeah, they've never seen one.
TV's come ready tuned to all the commercial channels. What are you talking about?
Yeah, tuned. I don't think they even come tuned.
No, well, that's true. Tuned. I'll just tune the internet for a while.
Yeah. We're showing our age.
Yes.
So and that was one of the reasons why I wanted to make this kind of work, because it's, you know, it's much simpler if you can show someone something visual, then there's a direct there can be direct inference without the gap of language and like cultural ideas.
Yeah, well, it certainly seems to be doing that, which is really good, and it's. I think we're sort of probably time to wind up a bit now. We could do. I was trying to think if there was any sort of like, you know, killer question I can ask, but of course there isn't one really. I mean, I think from my perspective, it's been really great working with you. I really enjoy it, and I really, you know, want to continue doing it. And so I, you know, obviously not now, but we will talk more about actually bringing something a bit more into a lab base where we're asking people several questions about something and seeing if we can sort of see if there's something that we can identify. Actually, well, look, this particular type of stimulus appears this way to somebody who has visual study, because the way it interacts with, so what comes in interacts with what's already there. So I'll certainly need your help on that. But yeah,
I'd love to.
It's great. It's fantastic. Thank you.
Oh, yay. Yeah, thanks. It's been really great meeting you. And I've just, it was always really the dream to collaborate with a scientist on this. And I'm really excited about kind of ideas about citizen science and everybody being more excited about science and more kind of literate in science, or at least thinking that they can be in a kind of very, just in the way that you can be excited about reading a book, you can be excited about thinking about a scientific concept. So yeah, this is just great.
Well, it's working. Good. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening / watching.
Bye. Thank you.